All right, my loves, this is your girl, Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach. Feeling good, feeling great, smelling good, fresh out the shower. Shampooed and conditioned hair. Smelling right, like a peach, the peach that I am. Let's go ahead and transcend these levels of consciousness, okay? Discovering the presence of God. Discovering the presence of God.
By new discovery, another part longs to cling to the familiar, even if it is flawed or grossly incorrect. New discovery brings challenge as well as promise, and actual value is derived from practice, application, and experience over time. Of value in the advances in the understanding of consciousness are redefinition, clarification, and recontextualization that reveal new meanings and comprehension at greater depth. What follows is a distillation of pragmatic applications of confirmable truth for seriously committed spiritual endeavor, and to that end is this work dedicated. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Introduction. The straightest way to spiritual evolution and advanced states of consciousness is via the field of consciousness itself, which is the nonlinear radiance of divine energy that is the substrate of all that exists. The condition of enlightenment is the state of pure radiance that shines forth as the presence, self. The self is the essence of spiritual existence and reality as subjectively known by virtue of effulgent identity. The radiance and effulgence of the nonlinear self are autonomous, consequent to relinquishment of the linear ego positionalities and emotions that preclude their realization. The phenomenon of enlightenment is thus analogous to the shining forth of the sun when the clouds have been removed. The radiance of the sun cannot be acquired, forced, or obtained, all of which are linear concepts, consequent to the suppositions of the ego mind's belief in cause and effect. There is no cause in enlightenment any more than there is a cause of God. Such ideas represent misconceptions of theology and limitations of the dualistic, linear ego mind. Thus, one does not get enlightenment, nor is there any personal self to whom the condition could be applied, much less held as a quality or attribute. The way to enlightenment is simply that of surrendering the barriers that preclude the state of realization. The personal self, therefore, does not become enlightened, but instead falls away and is replaced by the previously obscured reality of the self as the radiance of God immanent. This is in contrast to linear concepts and beliefs about God as being primarily only transcendent and therefore elsewhere in time and location. The purpose of the work here presented is to share the subjective unfoldment of inner realization in such a manner that it potentiates the process in the student and provides the essential information that facilitates the major evolution of the subjectivity of reality to awareness. The intention is to potentiate the spiritual aspirant's inner search for the ultimate source of existence as the radiant divinity that is simultaneously within and without, and simultaneously neither, yet both. The pathway described represents the concordance of devotion and truth plus intention and inspirational confirmation by experiential and testimonial declaration. Thus, the literary style is declarative rather than the customary provisional or tentative. The inner reality resonates as the absolute, which is of a different quality as a consequence of its source. The style of presentation is itself designed to facilitate the resonance of recognition that awaits activation in the seeker, since the self of the reader and the writer are actually one and the same. To summarize, the purpose of this presentation is to provide the essential information needed to successfully pursue the pathway to enlightenment, along with practical guidelines and methods of applying the information to the seeker's personal inner states of spiritual evolution. Therefore, what follows is neither philosophy nor metaphysics, neither pedagogy nor theology, but is instead a distillation of the core truths of spiritual reality as they become progressively discernible and experientially comprehensible along the progressive path. Because spiritual evolution does not proceed along a logical, linear, definable, predictable timeline, what could be considered very advanced instruction is presented from the very beginning and recurrently throughout this treatise manual. Important themes are represented as comprehension is facilitated by context and familiarity. Herein is provided all that one needs to know to reach the state or condition of consciousness termed enlightened, self-realization, jivanmukta, liberation, calibrates as true. Section 1, the spiritual process. Section 1, overview. The ultimate truth is radically subjective and also confirmable by consciousness research. Both ways will be described in the sequence of their emergence with the development of an empirical science of consciousness. Subjective, experiential, mystical states of advanced awareness and enlightenment can now be verified objectively by a method that transcends both time and place. Subjective, experiential. Prior to age 3, there was oblivion. Then, out of the void of nothingness, there arose a sudden and shocking awareness of personal existence, as though a strong light had been turned on. Spontaneously, unwelcome, and without words, came the awareness of existence itself as the experiential basis of the subjective state. Almost immediately arose the fear of its seeming opposite, the hypothetical possibility of non-existence. Thus, at age 3, there was confrontation with the dualities of existence versus non-existence as the ultimate reality, and the polarity of the ultimate reality as allness versus nothingness. The experience was totally nonverbal, but overwhelmingly and starkly confrontive. Ordinary childhood activities were boring, and refuge was sought in philosophy and an introspective, introverted lifestyle. Academic success was easy and led to the eager reading of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and others whose minds had become mental companions. On the other hand, beauty was entrancing, and appreciation for the great cathedrals and sacred classical music led to the study of music and voice as a boy soprano in the choir of a great cathedral. Home life was rural and episcopal. Late one day, as a paper boy in a blizzard after dark, refuge was sought from 10 below zero winds. Relief was found in a hollowed-out snowbank, and then emerged the exquisite onset of a state of consciousness in which the mind melted and became silent. A presence, timeless, gentle, yet infinitely powerful, pervaded, and its overwhelming love replaced mentalization. Time stopped, and the awareness of oneness with eternity replaced all thought or sense of a personal self. The I-ness of the presence revealed itself as allness. It was knowable as being beyond all universes, unspeakable, invisible, all-pervading, inexplicable, and beyond names. Subsequently, all fear of death disappeared, and life continued spontaneously of its own accord. This state was never mentioned to anyone. Then came World War II and hazardous duty on a minesweeper, which was facilitated by the loss of the fear of death. The demands of earthly life insisted on being given attention and involvement. The re-energizing of the intellect enabled successful academic years, graduation from medical school, plus years spent in psychiatry and psychoanalysis. The development of a huge psychiatric practice in New York followed. After 25 years of exhausting work, the yearning to return to the truth and the presence of God as the state of bliss led to a resumption of intensive meditation. One day, while walking in the woods, there came unasked a massive revelation of the totality of human suffering throughout all time, which resulted in an overwhelming feeling of shock and dismay that God could allow such conditions to occur. The mind blamed God and then became atheistic. The burning question still persisted. If there was no God, then what was the core of the truth of existence? Buddhism was attractive because it avoided the use of the term God. There was despair at having lost the revelation of reality. This led to intense meditation and a driven inner searching for truth itself, eventually resulting in severe existential depression and desperation. As the depths of the psyche were explored with fixity of purpose, the intense meditative state led to realms of severe despair and eventually to the depths of hell in timeless dimensions of eternal agony in which one is forever cut off from the light. The depths are endless, and one comes to the knowingness of the meaning of abandon hope, all ye who enter here. The terror of eternal isolation followed without any hope of its termination or even relief by extermination, for there was not even the possibility of death as the ultimate escape. Next followed the surrender of hope itself, which was replaced by a timeless dread. Then, from within, a silent voice cried out, "If there is a God, I ask for help." This was followed by oblivion, and then the mind went into a state of silence. Finally, awareness returned, but the appearance of the world had changed and was dramatically transformed. It was now a silent, unified oneness, magnificent in its brilliance that shone forth the divinity of all existence. It magnified a single remaining discordant disparity, the persistence of a personal sense of a self as the core of one's life and existence. It was clear that this also had to be surrendered to the presence. Then the fear of real death arose as terror. But with the terror also came the knowingness of an instruction from Zen Buddhism. Walk straight ahead, no matter what. All fear is illusion. The necessity to abandon and surrender the identity of self as the source of one's existence was a powerful knowingness. The will to live, the seeming core of life itself, was then surrendered to God, followed by a few moments of terrifying agony and then the experience of death itself. This was unlike bodily death, where one finds oneself suddenly free and looking at the body lying there, which had happened several times previously. No, this is the first and only time that death can be experienced. The finality of the death was overwhelming. At last, the agony was over and was replaced by splendor and magnificence, infinite stillness, silence, and the peace of profound, infinite love. The mind was dumbfounded and overwhelmed with awe. It then became silent and disappeared. Henceforth, only the presence prevailed, and all emerged autonomously without a personal will or motivation. The condition was a permanent replacement of the personal self, a silent, universal, timeless presence by which the totality of allness replaces any prior states of consciousness or the presumption of a personal self or I. Curiously, without motivation, the body moved spontaneously and continued to perform activities that were autonomous, as there was no thinker to think, no planner to plan, nor any doer to do. All occurred of its own essence as potentiality expressed itself as actuality. The condition can best be described as the unmanifests becoming manifest. Henceforth, life unfolded on its own. The condition was unspeakable, and no mention of it was made to anyone for more than 30 years. The condition eventually required leaving ordinary worldly life and moving to a remote rural area for years of meditation, solitude, and adjustment to the state. Within the condition, understandings spontaneously arose that were without thought. As a prior Hinayana Buddhist, I had believed that the ultimate reality of the Buddha nature was nothingness or void. That was an error, because voidness itself is a belief system that, however, had recurred as an experiential reality during meditations in this lifetime. With the constant pursuit of the pathway of negation, attachment, or aversion to form, the condition of voidness would return, enormously impressive, infinite, beyond space, time, or description, omnipresent, all-pervasive, and beyond all thought or volition. Yet, despite its seeming non-linear totality, there was the awareness of the absence of a critical quality that had been experienced as a youth in the snowbank. The exquisite softness, the at-homeness, the familiarity, recognition of the essence of the totality of reality as all-inclusive love. This quality of love is beyond joy or ecstasy and is intrinsic to the state of peace. Strikingly, the void is very similar to the ultimate state, except that it is devoid of the love that is the very essence of divinity. Without love, the void is like infinite, timeless, empty space. Devoid of the quality that identifies it as divinity, the void is a limitation. This appeared to be the final, great polarity duality of the seeming opposites, the resolution of which permitted the realization of the self as the allness and oneness out of which creation emerges. The prior paragraph calibrates at 1000. The development of consciousness research. After years of solitude, there was a stirring to once again include the world. People asked questions, and so a sharing, teaching function began. Yet, there was still no way to explain the inner state or demonstrate a pathway other than by the traditional modes of providing information, inspiration, and instruction on meditation. Then, fortuitously, there was an invitation to attend a lecture on kinesiology in a class taught by Dr. John Diamond. While the class and the teacher contextualized the kinesiological response as a local phenomenon, it was witnessed by this state of consciousness as an impersonal response of universal consciousness itself. It was obvious that the field of consciousness is like an infinite, motionless, electrostatic field capable of responding concordantly to the level of strength of the energy of a stimulus. It was easily demonstrated that what is true or pro-life resulted in a positive response, yes. In contrast to falsehood or a stimulus of energy inimical to life, the response was muscular weakness, a no. Then it became clear that the response was actually not a yes versus a no, but a yes or a not yes. With study, the kinesiological response was found to occur along a gradient that was aligned with the level of energy of a stimulus. A spectrum of responses appeared concordant with the quality of the stimulus. This observation led to the experimental improvisation of an arbitrary mathematical scale. Critical to the development of an empirical clinical science of consciousness calibration research was a fortuitous observation that whereas fluorescent light, pesticides, and artificial sweeteners made everyone go weak, They did not do so in a group of students of A Course in Miracles after they had progressed to about lesson 75. The course consists of 365 daily lessons. Thus, the kinesiological response was related to the level of consciousness, cessation of seeing oneself as a victim of external causes, and reowning one's power. By research and observation, it was discovered that all life in all its expressions reflects an innate level of energy, from weak to strong. This spectrum led itself to the development of a calibratable numerical scale that proved, however, to be impractical due to the extreme numbers that were required to keep pace with their numerical designation. This problem was solved by utilizing a logarithmic scale to the base 10 that permitted the pragmatic use of an arbitrary scale ranging from 1 to 1,000. Calibration level 1 reflected the first discernible energy of life, consciousness, on this planet, bacteria, and continued through the plant and animal kingdoms to level 1,000 as the ultimate possibility on Earth. Level 1000 turned out to be the consciousness level reached by only a few people in all of human history. The great avatars, such as Jesus Christ, the Buddha, Krishna, and Zoroaster. The energy spectrum scale numerically reflected the calibration of the consciousness level of all possibilities of animal or human life. By use of the scale, one could track the evolution of consciousness from its first appearance as life to its ultimate expression as the state of enlightenment itself. There followed years of research and application of calibrating the consciousness levels of thousands of individuals, places, concepts, writings, belief systems, emotions, intellectual levels, and even more importantly, all spiritual states, religions, spiritual teachers, spiritual pathways, saints, and sages. In every religion, the mystics, that is, self-realized, enlightened, calibrated the highest on the scale of consciousness, but were very few in number. On the calibrated scale, 600 was the level that differentiated enlightened states of non-duality from saintly, unconditional states that calibrate in the high 500s and include many spiritual teachers and famous saints. Level 500 indicated a change in paradigm from intellectualization to experiential subjectivity and denoted various levels of love. It was also notable that only 4% of the world's population reached calibration level 500, and only 0.4% reached level 540, unconditional love. Consciousness level 600 was extremely rare. The level of the 400s represents intellect, reason, logic, science, and the Newtonian paradigm. For most educated spiritual seekers, the 400s represent a springboard, but also often a great barrier, and it is notable that Einstein, Freud, and Sir Isaac Newton all calibrated at 499. The 200s and 300s indicate integrity, goodwill, morality, and overall goodness of intention. Then came the crucial discovery that consciousness level 200 is critical because it demarcates truth from falsehood. It was also noted that levels above 200 represent power, and those below 200 represent force. The levels below 200 descend into the obvious egotisms as well as animal instincts of pride, desire, greed, anger, hate, guilt, shame, and apathy. The calibrated levels also correlate with the capacity for spiritual insight, emotionality, and perceptions of the world and self. The calibrated scale and its correlations enabled the construction of the now widely known map of consciousness. The ego mind is a dualistic construction that originated as animal consciousness, which, eons later, evolved through primitive hominids and finally to Homo sapiens, in which a prefrontal cortex was added to the old animal brain, providing the capacity for linear conceptual thought. Thus, initially, the mind primarily became a new tool for the expression of animal instincts through what is now called the ego. Examination of the mind structure shows that its function is comparable to the hardware of a computer, and the software represents the programming by society as well as by inherited influences. The fundamental innocence of mankind is based on the reality that the human mind is incapable of discerning truth from falsehood. It has no innate defense against the utilization of its hardware to play any introduced software program without prior approval, discernment, or options of the will, for instance, the impact of the media. Due to the nature of the software and the underlying hardware, the mind's primary illusion is the differentiation of consciousness into a basic duality of a personal I, ego, self, as being separate from the infinite self as the source of consciousness awareness. In this illusory error, the ego identifies with content instead of context, and is therefore subject to the vicissitudes of animal motives, feelings, and faulty intellection. The calibrated level of consciousness indicates the degree of impairment of the capacity for recognition of reality by substitution of perception, distortion, and the misidentification of appearance with essence. Also of great interest was the discovery that every single action, feeling, or thought registers permanently beyond time and space in the all-encompassing contextual field of consciousness. Therefore, any event, whether a thought, feeling, or action, is forever identifiable and retrievable by appropriate means, such as the consciousness calibration technique. The fields of consciousness consist of energy vibrations whose patterns leave a distinguishable track and are experienced as subjectivity. Out of the patterning of the vibrational track arise the forms inherent in karmic consequences of acts of the will. The dualistic structure of the ego stems from the core factor of linear positionality. A centralizing image of a personal self emerges as the belief of an individual personal self as an agent, that is, the thinker of thoughts, the doer of actions, and the repository of guilt and self-blame. Some qualities are rejected and become buried in the unconscious, along with their emotions, which are the residuals of animal instincts. Only after evolution to consciousness level 200 does an etheric brain emerge that is functionally capable of spiritual awareness, intention, and karmic responsibility. Naively, personal consciousness identifies the self with body, mind, and emotions. Then, by good fortune, or as a result of karmic merit, spiritual truth is heard and becomes inspirational, and, with further good fortune, a spiritual teacher is encountered. The high vibrational frequencies of the teacher's aura activate the nascent, etheric, higher spiritual bodies in the spiritual student. The activation of the etheric brain in higher spiritual beings is a consequence of the rising of the Kundalini, or spiritual energies, which results not only in the formation of higher spiritual bodies and the etheric brain, but also actually changes the physiology of the human brain, which now tracks incoming stimuli differently. The person becomes more right brain. Below consciousness level 200, an incoming stimulus is rapidly radiated to the emotional centers, whereas in a spiritually oriented person, the faster track goes from stimulus to prefrontal cortex and then to the emotional center. In highly evolved spiritual people, the incoming information is processed through the etheric prefrontal cortex and then goes by induction to the physical neuronal circuits in the brain. Below consciousness level 200, animal reactivity predominates as transmission of the incoming information via the prefrontal cortex is slower than the direct route to the emotional center. Thus, below 200, the mind is set for fight or flight, or stress responses that disrupt the energy flow through the acupuncture system and are reflected in a negative kinesiological response. Above 200, the processing results in a greater feeling of inner peace and harmony, and the brain neurotransmitters release endorphins rather than adrenaline. Refer to brain physiology chart as discussed in Chapter 6. With activation, spiritual energy now flows up the chakra system, out of the base of survival and sexuality, through the spleen of the dark side of emotionality, and up through the solar plexus to activate achievement, aggressive acquisition, and wantingness. With spiritual intentionality and assent of the will, spiritual endeavor then leads to the predominant energy accumulation of the heart at consciousness level 500, reflected as concern for others. Further purification leads to unconditional love, which calibrates at 540. The high 500s represent joy and ecstasy, leading to 600, the level of peace and the classic opening of the third eye of discernment of the Buddhic, etheric, spiritual body. The consciousness level of mankind evolved very slowly over the millennia. Lucy, presumably the progenitor of all developmental lines of hominids, emerged approximately 3 million years ago at calibration level 70. Much later emerged Neanderthal man, who calibrated at 75. Then Homo erectus at 80. And finally, modern man 600,000 years ago as Homo sapiens idelta at 85. At the time of the birth of the Buddha, the consciousness level of all mankind stood at 90, and by the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, it had reached 100. The consciousness level of mankind through the last 5 or 6 centuries remained at 190, where it stayed until the late 1980s, when, coincident with the time of the harmonic convergence, it made a spectacular jump to 205. It remained at that level for the next 17 years, and then suddenly, in November 2003, concomitant with the harmonic concordance, it jumped to 207. Interestingly, this significant event was observed and recorded at the end of a lecture given on that day in front of a large audience in San Francisco. At 5:15 p.m., the consciousness level was again reaffirmed at its previous level of 205, and by 5:30 p.m., it had reached 207, where it remained until recently when it went back down to the present level of 206 due to the impact of the media and world events. By understanding and accepting the nature of the ego, it is transcended and finally collapses and disappears when all its positionalities and their resultant dualities have been surrendered. The ego does not become enlightened, but instead disappears, and a transcendental reality replaces it. Just as the sun shines forth when the clouds disappear, the reality of the self shines forth of its own as revelation, realization, and enlightenment. Descriptively, it is a condition that replaces the prior state of consciousness. Its occurrence has been subjectively reported as being identical in nature throughout the ages and in all cultures in which all realized mystics and avatars agree that it is profound and beyond adequate languaging. At the last doorway to enlightenment stands the ego's final challenge, which is the central core belief that it is the source and locus of not only identity, but also of life itself. At that point, one is all alone and shorn of all protection or comforting props, belief systems, or even memory. There is solely available within one's aura the high-frequency vibration of the consciousness of the enlightened teacher, with its encoded.
You know, I think it's a damn shame that I'm over here trying to put some knowledge in y'all head and y'all don't want to get it. It's a shame, it really is. I don't know what to say about y'all people. Come on over to Empress Goddess Presents, y'all. This is what I'm dropping.
Knowingness. The last step is intuited as a finality from which no turning back is
If
possible.
you want some more, come
And
on over.
thus, there is consternation at the absoluteness of the finality. Then arises the knowingness to walk straight ahead no matter what, for all fear is illusion. As this last step is taken by the spiritual will, death is experienced, but the fierce anguish lasts for only a few moments. The death of the ego is the only actual death that one can possibly experience, in contrast to which the previous deaths of leaving the body were relatively trivial. The experience of death is terminated by awe at the revelation of the ultimate reality. And then even the awe disappears, and the self transcends the duality of existence versus non-existence, allness versus nothingness, and omnipresence versus void. Even isness and beingness are seen as meaningless mentations. The state of infinite love dissolves all languaging, nouns, adjectives, and verbs, for the supreme is beyond names or divisions. The peace of the silence is the subjectivity. Curiously, the body continues to function on its own, without any internal doer. Action occurs of its own, without volition or intention. There is the realization that potentiality manifests as the emergence of evolution as the phenomenon of creation by which the unmanifest becomes manifest. Reality is then realized as context rather than just content. Life is an expression of eternal consciousness, and therefore actual real death is not a possibility, which is a corollary to the more familiar laws of the conservation of energy and matter. Everyone already has a calibratable level of consciousness at birth that is reflective of karmic inheritance. Earthly life can be seen as a staging platform to other dimensional levels of consciousness. Everyone is on an evolutionary journey of that consciousness, and compassion is born out of that realization by the exclamation, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Enlightenment is the consequence of the surrender of all dualistic illusions to truth. All suffering ends with dissolution of the ego's positionalities. Thus do we praise the Lord God for radiating light to the world. Chapter 1. Devotional Non-Duality. Introduction. Spiritual evolution is accelerated consequent to intention, alignment, dedication, and clarity, as well as efficiency of time and effort. Thus, precision of the process is facilitated